Today I have for you not one, but two of the greatest attacking games ever played by the greatest attacking chess goddess the world has ever seen. She's the closest there's ever been to a real-life Beth Harmon, and over the course of her illustrious career has scored wins against pretty much every top player of her day, including current and former world champions like Karpov, Kasparov, Anand, Kramnik, and Magnus Carlsen. I am, of course, talking about the one and only strongest female player to ever exist, Judit Polgar. And lest there be any confusion about just how good she was in her prime, just think about this for a minute. In July of 2005, at her peak, Judit Polgar was ranked number 8 in the world, and with a FIDE rating of 2735, was a mere 77 points away from being the strongest chess player on the planet, who at that time was Garry Kasparov with a rating of 2812. So, for anyone who thinks that chess must inevitably be dominated by males at the very highest level, well, all you gotta do is take a look at the resume of Judit Polgar to realize that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. And what a resume it is. So many brilliant games, I couldn't even decide on just one, so I got two for you. The first is an absolute masterpiece. Some have gone as far as to call it the greatest game that Judit Polgar has ever played, but I'll let you decide if you're in any condition to do anything after it melts your face clean off. The year is 1994. Judit Polgar is up against the world's number 3, Alexei Shirov, who, with the white pieces, does kick off this spectacular struggle with e4. Judit responds with the godfather of defenses, c5, the Sicilian. We have the horse head going to f3, e6, known as the Taimanov variation, activating the DSB. Alexei hits that center with d4. A pair of scouts are exchanged as the knight recaptures. We have knight to c6, knight to c3. Very mainline stuff so far, but now comes a slightly unusual move, d6, transposing into what is known as a Scheveningen type structure, as indicated by these two pawns on d6 and e6. Now, much more common would be for black to have his knight on f6 here instead of on c6, but after g4 from Alexei, a6, keeping any and all white pieces out of b5 while preparing a future pawn thrust to that square, and bishop to e3, we now become privy to Judit's plan for her kingside knight, which is to develop it to e7, hemming in her dark squared bishop for the moment, but at least white's thematic pawn push to g5 will not be coming with an attack on that knight, as it would be if the knight were sitting on the more normal f6 square. Next is knight to b3. With black's knights now connected, there was the idea of taking on d4 at some point, followed by knight to c6, with tempo on whatever piece recaptured, whether bishop or queen. Alexei knows that this would have only helped alleviate Judit's somewhat cramped position, opening the e7 square for her bishop, so that's why knight to b3 was played. Next, we have your standard queenside counter thrust with b5, a move based on the very sound assumption that white will probably be castling on that side of the board. We have more kingside expansion now with f4. Judit puts her bishop on the long diagonal, and now comes a bit of an inaccuracy with the move queen to f3. The more standard looking queen to d2 was much better, but to the layman, and apparently even to the world's number 3 player, exactly what's wrong with queen to f3 is far from obvious. What would you play here as black? The strongest move, now played by Judit, is g5, offering a pawn in order to take control of the e5 square. Now the engine is recommending that white just ignore this move and get the king castled, allowing g takes f4, followed by knight to g6, hitting whatever piece recaptured, and then knight c to e5. But Alexei decides to go ahead and grab the pawn on g5, which is also playable. After all, a pawn is a pawn. Of course, this does immediately make available the beautiful e5 square, which is where Judit now places her knight, hitting the queen, which drops back to g2, keeping defensive g4. Next is b4, attacking the c3 knight. It goes to e2. And now comes another blindingly accurate move, h5, whose main purpose, you might think, is to activate the rook on h8. But it isn't, as evidenced by white's best reply in this position, which is to just let the pawn go with something like knight to g3 guarding f5. Or you can castle first and then play knight to g3. But Alexei, oblivious to the impending danger, thinks that he's all good to just take the pawn on h5, removing defense from the f5 square, allowing Judit to commence a powerful tactical sequence beginning with knight to f5, exploiting the pin on the e4 pawn, which may not capture the knight unless white wants to lose his queen. The bishop on e3 is now under attack. Alexei knows that if he moves it anywhere besides f2, then Judit will be able to play knight to h4 with tempo on his queen, followed by the horrific infiltration to f3 with check, defended by the other knight, when on top of all his other woes, white will no longer be able to castle. So we have bishop to f2, guarding that h4 square. And this is the moment where the genius of Judit Polgar really goes next level, as she comes up with an absolute stunner of a move that I have to assume, well, I guess I don't have to assume, but I want to assume that she saw coming 5 moves ago when she sacrificed her pawn on g5. Because without this move, white would be the preferred side. You know, he's only 1 move away from castling, and where, pray tell, is Judith's king going to take refuge if and when her attack fizzles out? Nowhere. So the moment of reckoning is here. Black needs to make something happen, and in this position, Judit does just that by playing her solitary winning move. Take a moment if you'd like to try to spot it. The move is queen takes g5, a gorgeous queen sacrifice, which if accepted with queen takes g5 would fail beautifully to knight to f3 check, forking king and queen. So after king to d1 and knight takes queen, white still can't take the knight on f5 or he loses his rook on h1. You could try knight to d2, adding defense to the e4 pawn, which can't be saved, but at least after knight takes e4, threatening to win the bishop on f2, you can make the trade, and after bishop takes e4, hitting the rook, and rook to g1, the pawn on h5 will fall. Now black's a pawn up, with the more active pieces, the safer king, and according to Stockfish, an advantage worth nearly 4 pawns. Alexei could see that this was no sewer pipe crawl to redemption. In the game, where after the lovely offering of her Dark Majesty on g5, he decides to try knight to a5, attacking that troublesome b7 bishop, which if removed from the board would eliminate the pin on the e4 pawn, allowing white to capture the knight on f5 with a winning position. But do you think Judith's going to come this far without having another brutal tactical shot up her sleeve? Of course not. See if you can spot her most crushing response in this position. The move is knight to e3, attacking the white queen, while hitting the c2 square and so threatening a fork. This leaves the queen on g5 still undefended, but if white were to take it, then after knight to f3 check, it's not even about picking up the white queen anymore, because who needs a queen when you've just delivered checkmate unto the white king, who can no longer go to d1 as that square is covered by the knight on e3. So what to do as white here? Well, you could take the knight on e3, but after queen takes e3, what is to be done about the threat of knight to f3 check followed by king to d1 and queen to d2 checkmate? Well, if you don't want to sack your queen for the knight when it gets to f3, then you got to add some defense to d2 with knight to b3. But after bishop takes e4, at the very least, black is going to be winning the rook on h1, since if queen to g1 trying to defend, then knight to f3 check is a fork of king and queen. Although after king to d1, black's quickest way to win is not even to take the queen, but rather with bishop takes c2 check, king takes c2, queen to e4 check, king to c1, and bishop to h6 check, with mate coming in another 7 moves. What's tried in the game, in response to the moving of the knight to e3, is white's only reasonable alternative to his aforementioned hopelessly losing options, and that's another hopelessly losing move, queen to g3, allowing queen takes g3, knight takes g3, and knight takes c2 check. The king goes to d1, the rook on a1 falls, so does the bishop on b7, so if the knight on a1 could somehow be trapped, then white might actually have a slight glimmer of hope. But Judit, being the ruthless woman that she is, immediately squelches that idea with the move b3, supporting the knight going to c2. Though infinitely more hazardous than that is the threat of b takes a2, followed by the promotion of the pawn in another couple moves. So we have a takes b3, the knight escapes, Judit is a good clean exchange up. The game continues for a bit with king to c2, knight to c5, the ponies are exchanged. We have bishop to e1, looking to rd the dsb on the ldsd. The n goes to f3, the bishop to c3, attacking the rook, the knight blocks with check. We have king to d3, bishop to d6, bishop to g2, threatening a little e5 with the discovery on the rook. Judit neutralizes that with bishop to e5, while also defending the knight on d4, which is attacked twice. Why Alexei didn't take that knight and win a pawn on his previous move, I don't rightly know. It wouldn't have saved his game anyway. We do have a few more moves with king to c4, king to e7, rook to a1, and knight to c6, at which point Alexei Shirov decides to resign the game, seeing that he's got no good way to avoid the trade of bishops, which will further simplify the position, giving Judit a fairly elementary winning endgame with her decisive material advantage. So what did you think? Was that not an absolute massacre? I don't know, there's just something about the way Judit Polgar attacks with her ruthlessly razor-sharp precision. It really reminds me of what happens when I try to play against Stockfish at full strength, which is actually kind of fun to do, and strangely relaxing, because the outcome of the game is never in any doubt. You know you're getting demolished, so it's just a question of how long can you survive. And in that way, it does sort of resemble real life, because nobody's getting out of this alive. All you can really do is try to make good, healthy decisions, to try to delay the Grim Reaper's inevitable checkmate for as long as possible. But I'm pretty heavily digressing here. Let's move on to the next game. In my opinion, this one is even more astonishing than the game we just saw. It features a sacrificial kingside onslaught that, to me, looks like it just shouldn't work. It's not like one where you sack a couple pieces and then you have some obvious mating attack. This looks more like something Alpha Zero would do, where it gives up material for some abstract advantage that you just can't wrap your head around. And there's even a point in this game where, if I had Judit's position, I'd probably think I'm losing, even though the total opposite is actually the case. But enough said, let's look at some moves. The year is 2003, Judit Polgar has Team White in this one. She's up against the fellow Hungarian Super GM by the name of Ferenc Berkus, and she opens the game with e4. Ferenc replies e6, the French defense. We have your standard d4, taking the center, d5, challenging that center, knight to c3 defending, knight to f6 attacking, bishop to g5 pinning, the d-pawn capturing, the knight recapturing, the bishop e7ing while unpinning, now threatening knight takes e4. White could now take on f6 with the knight, and that would be just fine, but Judit opts for bishop to f6. That way, after the recapture, she needn't worry about responding to the threat of bishop takes bishop on g5, since there is no longer a bishop on g5, and can therefore continue her development with knight to f3. We have a ringside castling, and yes, you did hear me correctly, I did say ringside, because spoiler alert, this is where all the action is going to be taking place, which is not good news for the Black King. He's not really interested in having a front row seat to his own destruction, but unfortunately for him, that's exactly what he's going to get. We have queen to d2, preparing a queenside castling, knight to d7, a queenside castling, bishop to e7, bishop to d3, getting lined up on h7, I'm loving it. b6, preparing some possible light squared bishop deployment on the queen side, but after knight e to g5, Black first must deal with the double attack on his h7 pawn. So we have h6, and what do you think Judit plays here? What would you play? Would you retreat your knight in shame back to the e4 square, effectively conceding that you've wasted two moves? Well, maybe not completely wasted, since Black's kingside has been weakened a bit by this move h6, but it wouldn't really be worth it. Would you play h4 instead, offering Black the knight in order to open up the h-file? If so, congratulations, you found the second best move in the position, and it's a totally respectable one. But Judit, like a freaking engine, now plays the top choice of Stockfish, which is bishop to h7 check. Ferenc makes the easy decision to put his king on h8, and now we have bishop to e4, taking control of the long diagonal, which is where Black would have otherwise deployed his bishop with bishop to b7. But now with his rook under attack, something needs to be done. The engine's calling for bishop takes g5, followed by rook to b8, or just rook to b8, but Ferenc now comes to the conclusion that it's in his best interest to capture the knight on g5 with a pawn. A move which, despite being a catastrophic blunder, is one that I have no choice but to respect, because I wouldn't know how to punish it. What do you think White should play here? There is but one winning move, and it's not bishop takes rook on a8, which is surely what Ferenc was hoping for, seeing that after g4, Black will be picking up a second minor piece for his lost rook, with a winning advantage. Why is this so? Well, it's because if the knight on f3 were to move, well, let's say to e5 for example, well here we have bishop to g5 with a little oops-a-daisy to the white queen who is now pinned to her king and will be lost. Judit, seeing right through this little trap, declines taking the rook on a8 and instead plays her single winning move in the position, g4, which looks kind of weird. I mean, she's a piece down. How is this nothing burger the best move? Well, after Ferentz's response, rook to b8, and Judith's follow-up, h4, the hideous truth begins to rear its ugly head. And that is, because of this move g4, black's pawn is fixed on g5 and may not move forward, which means there is no way for black to prevent the opening of the h-file with h takes g5 next. Since if you try taking on h4, then after g5, rook takes h4 is unstoppable. So what's tried in the game is g6, giving the king a square, so that after h takes g5 check, there's king to g7, and everything seems to be okay. Black can play rook to h8 next, and what does white have, besides a whole lot of nothing? Well, white has Judit Polgar at the helm for one, and she's about to uncork yet another only move in the position to secure her a winning advantage. Have a look if you want. I don't think I would find it. Then again, I probably wouldn't even be looking for it. I'd be too busy resigning. But here it is, the winning move, queen to f4. Okay, doesn't look very scary, but it should, because it comes with a very dire threat, which Judit actually gets to execute in the game. But before we take a look at that, we should probably talk about the obvious rook to h8. How is white not just losing here? Well, the answer is rook takes h8. Now, obviously, you don't want to recapture with the king, because then f7 falls, and just like that, after years of neglect, Bob suddenly wants to be your uncle. So you got to take with the queen, but now comes knight to e5, hitting f7 with the second piece, and so threatening mate in 1. Now, if the pawn is pushed to f6 or f5, then comes g takes f6 with a check, followed by rook to h1, defended by the bishop, driving the black queen off of the open file, followed by queen to h6 with check, and mate will not be far off. If the knight on e5 is captured, then we have queen takes e5 with check, followed by queen takes c7, hitting the bishop, hitting the rook, and that's pretty much all she wrote. So what's left? Well, you could defend f7 with something like queen to f8 or queen to g8, but then white gets to take over the h-file with rook to h1. And then what are you doing about queen to h2 followed by queen to h6 check? Bishop takes g5 check will be no solution. White will just play f4, and you ain't maintaining no defense of h6. And there's probably a lot more to this position that we could try to probe together, but let's have a look at what was tried in the game, shall we? Where in response to queen to f4, Ferentz decides to simply develop his bishop to b7, blissfully ignorant of the savage tactical blow that's about to shatter any fantasies he might have of not losing this game. Feel free to pause and ponder, but here it comes. The move is rook to h7 check. The king captures, because you kind of have to, otherwise the rooks were going to double up on the h-file and forcibly mate you, with the help of the queen if necessary. But now comes queen to h2 with check. The king scurries back to g8. On g7, it would have just been driven to g8 anyway with queen to h6 check. And now we have rook to h1, threatening mate in 1. But it's not quite over yet. Ferentz does have a check with bishop takes g5 check. And after knight takes bishop, the queen replaces it, again with check. Black is so close to escaping here. If the white king had to move, then he could play king to g7, and just like that, black would be winning. His king could escape checkmate via the f6 square, and white's got nothing but an overwhelming material deficit. But remember that move f4 we looked at a few moments ago? Well, it works here as well, since black now has no way to both save his queen and prevent checkmate on either h7 or h8. So he has no choice but to part with his queen. Ferentz takes the pawn on f4 with check, the queen recaptures. He throws in bishop takes e4 for whatever reason, and after queen takes e4, Ferenc Berkus decides to call it a day with a timely resignation. Black's got the minor piece and rook for the queen, plus an extra pawn, but his king is still chronically weak. His pieces hopelessly passive. He's got no good squares for his knight. He's got moves like queen to f4 to worry about, hitting c7, threatening to come into h6. So here's just one sample continuation for you. King to g7, preparing rook to h8, queen to f4, hitting c7, c5, d takes c5, b takes c5, queen to c7, hitting the knight, threatening rook to d1 to attack it again. And what are you going to do? Move it to f6, where it will be pinned to the king with queen to e5? That's not great. Maybe knight to b6? But here we have queen to e5 check, f6 is pretty much forced, queen to c7 check, and you can probably predict what's coming next. So there you are, two of the greatest games ever played by the great Judit Polgar. Let me know if and how they affected you. If you're feeling a bit overwhelmed by the sheer brutality of what you just witnessed, you might consider not driving or operating any heavy machinery for a while, but do consider subscribing to the channel to see more content like this on a regular basis. Like the video if you liked it, and I'll see you soon.